This assignment 4.1 is about the ethical and legal issues in sport and exercise science research, and during the PowerPoint we'll be talking about the ethical and legal issues prior to 1947 and what happened after to prevent this. And there will be some scenarios from gymnasts where these ethical and legal issues will either be put in place or they haven't. Ethical and legal definitions. So ethical is the moral principles that governs a person's behaviour or the conduction of an activity. This means that it is morally what's right and wrong when researching and in life, and it also means that no one involved will have any physical or emotional harm. Legal is working within the boundaries of the civil law. So this basically means what the law says, and it says what you're allowed and not allowed to do, and if you don't follow the law there will be consequences. Before 1947 there was no rules or code of conduct that researchers or scientists had to follow when experimenting on humans. This meant that they could force the humans without consent to do whatever they want them to do. They had no right to withdraw. During World War II, the Germans or the Nazis kept people as prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps and used them to conduct experiments on, but it was against their will and they had to be forced to do them. The Nazis tested these people by putting them through a lot of pain, horrible conditions, and even most of them led to death. These people were tested against their will and had no consent, which means they had no choice to take part. The Nazis were allowed to do this because there was no rules within the law or code of conduct that they had to follow. During the experiment, these participants were subjected to emotional and physical harm because they were subjects of the research and were subjected against their will. The Nazis researched different types of methods that will help them through various conditions during the war. For example, one of them was putting a prisoner through a lack of oxygen, which would help the pilots when they're flying at a higher altitude. Another one that they used the prisoners for experiments for was what would happen and how they can cure these diseases that the soldiers got. So they've done this by putting the disease in the humans and seeing what would happen to them, and most of them died doing this. Throughout these experiments there are many ethical and legal issues with using humans to experiment on. For example, there is no informed consent, which means that you give permission to take part in the experiment, and this is because you know about the knowledge and the consequences of what will happen during the experiment. There was also no right to withdraw, which means they had to carry on with the experiment literally until they died. There was also no health and safety, which means these Nazis were allowed to participate and do whatever they want to these prisoners, and they wouldn't check the situations around them to see if it's safe enough for them to take part in, because they didn't really care, which means that they lead to more deaths. After 1947, people realised that there had to be changes when experimenting with humans, and this led to a set of ethical principles. This happened with the Nuremberg trial. This Nuremberg trial looked at what the Nazis did to the prisoners during the World War and the experiments they conducted on them. And because this was what they did was so horrific and bad, this led to the Nuremberg Code being put in place in 1947. The Nuremberg Code is a set of 10 commandments or ethical principles that you have to follow if you're using humans in experiments. The Nuremberg Code is basically 10 rules that you have to follow when conducting experiments on humans, and they mainly talk about that the participants have to give their consent to be able to take part in the experiments, which means they have to volunteer. They want to take part in this experiment. They're not allowed to be forced or through any way of fraud or bribery to take part in this experiment. Also, it shows that they have the right to withdraw. So this means they don't have to carry on with the experiment. They can stop whenever they want to, and the researcher cannot force them to carry on taking part. This would be against their will. It also shows that when conducting experiments on humans that you will not provide any physical, psychological or emotional harm to these participants during the experiment, which could lead to long-term injuries, becoming disabled or even death. This is illegal and is one of the requirements that you have to follow, that you're not going to allow them to take part if any of these will happen. In 1964 there was the Declaration of Helsinki. These are ethical principles for research when conducting on human participants. This Declaration of Helsinki was developed by the World Medical Association, and this meant that these rules were put in place for when you were experimenting on humans, you had to follow them. Mainly, the Declaration of Helsinki says that the health of the participant is more important than the experiment, and then they should only take part if they volunteer and that want to take part, and if they can withdraw whenever they feel like it, to protect themselves and their safety. During human experimentation, the Nuremberg Code and Helsinki Code should be followed, otherwise there will be consequences. It's vital for them to be followed. This is because otherwise it means there could be a risk to the participant involved and the researcher, because they could lose their accreditation. This means that it is vital for consent to take place, so they can only take place if they want to and can withdraw at any time because they don't want to proceed anymore. This means that they have to be voluntary and they shouldn't be forced to take part, or bribery or fraud should not impact on their decision in taking part either. Also, it means that these studies should be based on good science, which means that these studies have to be relevant to something that's happening, so otherwise it could put these participants at risk even though they volunteered to do it. Also, the benefits should be more important than the risks. This is because if there's too many risks, there's a higher chance of the participants either getting injured or even more severe, and the benefits need to be important so that they can get good results and it's beneficial to everyone else as well as just the scientists. Also, participants should be able to withdraw whenever they feel like it if it's causing them too much stress they don't want to carry on, because they shouldn't be forced against their will to do it. Also, these experiments that are being taken place should be conducted by a scientific qualified person. That means that they know what they're doing, so the risks are quite minimal. Also, they should know what they're doing, and the protocol should be strong and should be reviewed by an independent committee. This means that you have to be informed by an ethics committee, and they give you the decision whether you can. They give you the ethical clearance whether you can proceed with this experiment or not. They're a group of people who know about your study and they're knowledgeable about your area, and will see if the risks are minimal and that you are able to take part and actually get the results that you need. If they do not follow these rules, there are consequences such as losing your job, civil actions, legal action, cause of injury or harm, a tribunal, fine, prison sentence, and not allowed to research any longer. BASES. This is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. What BASES has done is produced a code of conduct that you have to apply by when doing research, and this is for the scientists and the researchers. They've identified the ethical and legal issues that you have to follow when conducting experiments. They have a code of conduct, and this code of conduct has to be applied, you have to apply by the guidelines, or there'll be consequences. Bases outline the ethical and legal issues with the research that you're going to take place. This is how trusted as a researcher you'll be, and can they trust you to do the experiment. The role of bases is to have a code of conduct that researchers have to follow. The purpose of bases code of conduct is to reflect and give aims for its members. This means that when you are experimenting, you have to get a bases accreditation for the specific area that you're going to be studying. This is because they decide whether you're allowed to take part in the experiment and conduct it, or whether the risks are too high that you're not allowed to conduct it. Also, the bases accreditation is good for your status, to show that you're good at doing your research. When researching, you have to get approval from the recognised body as a bases member. Also, if you have a bases accreditation, it just shows how trusted you could be and reliable as a researcher. Zimbardo's prison experiment. This was an experiment where he picked some students from a university in the States where he equally split them in half as prisoners and guards to test their psychological effects of what would happen if you had the role of the prisoner or the guard in the prison. The reason he picked prisoners was because they had never been to prison before and wouldn't know what the experience would be like. And this would better test his theory to see if they could cope with the physical, emotional and psychological harm. And he wants to see what would happen to them. Throughout the experiment, the guards would torture and physically harm the prisoners because they think that they had a higher status in them, and this would lead to psychological torture. Some of the prisoners couldn't deal with this because the emotional and psychological harm got too much for them, and then this therefore increased the guards' power to harm them even more. Some of the participants, the prisoners, accepted the physical abuse throughout the experiment by the guards. The guards abused the prisoners who fought back because they were more able to handle them. Zimbardo allowed this abuse to take place during the experiment because he's the researcher and it would better test his experiment. However, it got too out of hand and it was abandoned after 6 days. This was because the abuse and the torture was harming the guards and the prisoners way too much, and this could lead to longer term physical and emotional and mental harm and the distress and trauma from thinking about the prison. However, nowadays you wouldn't be able to undertake this experiment. This is because of the consequences such as psychological harm and the Nuremberg Code, which states that you are not allowed to physically or psychologically harm any participants involved, because it will lead to consequences. And now they also can't be forced to take part in the experiment. It has to be voluntary, and they have to be able to withdraw whenever they feel like it, especially if they're getting abused. Milgram's experiment was an experiment where he would ask them a series of questions and they'd have to remember the answers. After a while, he would repeat these questions, and every time they got the question wrong, they would get an electric shock, and the voltage of the shock will keep increasing throughout, and they had to go all the way to the end, up to 420 volts. This then led to physical harm from the electrical current being so high.